good afternoon. Thank you so much for the third invitation to speak to you here at National Conservatives. When I first did so, it was last year in London, just round the corner from our beautiful, spectacular Westminster Abbey, a week after the King's coronation. I was then the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, and so the Minister responsible for public order. I had a really good seat in the pews of the Abbey to watch the coronation, but all I could think about during that spectacular ceremony was what's going on outside. Are the protesters going to attack the King's carriage? Are the police doing their job? What if something happens on this historic day? Happily, nothing did. It was the most successful and largest policing mission in our history. But the following week, I came to speak to you. NatCon in London was a huge success, a tribute to Yoram and James Orr and so many other good people. But my speech, like several others, was interrupted by placard-waving protesters who had infiltrated the event and jumped up on stage to solemnly tell us all off as we started speaking. Anyone about to do that here? Just give me some warning, I'm used to it. Tim Muniz, who's done so much for President Trump's logistics, did a brilliant job of organising that conference in London. But I remember him saying as well that he'd never seen anything like it. The protesters were very British. They were polite, and like everyone else, they were unarmed. But they were sanctimonious and smug. However, we just laughed them off and we carried on, and the event was a great success. Fast forward to earlier this year, and you invited me to speak to you in Brussels. There, the man shut us down and set the police on us. In fact, I think, again, the heroic organisers, hello again, James and Yoram, had to change the venue 3 times before we were allowed to speak. But they tried to stop us. They tried to squeeze private business, our host at the hotel venue. They used the useful idiot local politicians. They had the police follow their rules, and they took us to court expecting to win, which they would have done if it wasn't for the heroes at the ADF. The Alliance Defending Freedom are lawyers who give other lawyers a good name. And I say that as a recovering lawyer. But it was such a telling moment. There was I, a former Tory Home Secretary, a democratically elected member of the UK Parliament, waiting to speak, when in a civilised, law-abiding Western democracy, right at the heart of the rules-based European Union, the police came in to shut us down for talking. Now, those of you who were there may well remember that barnstorming speech that Nigel Farage made undaunted. But then Nigel, a bit like Donald Trump, is not one to shy away from a fight. Now, he and I don't agree on every single thing, and we are in different parties, but you have to admire courage. But what does this crazy episode tell us? Well, of course, have good lawyers. That's definitely the first thing. But also, just how nakedly intolerant the left are. Because rather than let us speak and discuss and exchange ideas, they tried to shut us down. Why? Because we are intolerable. We're not legitimate actors. Our humdrum speech isn't permissible. They have the rules, they have the laws, they have the politicians, and they have the brazen expectation that they'll get away with doing stuff like that. Now, needless to say, once they tried it on, the usual voices who screech about civil liberties and freedom of speech were remarkably quiet when it came to my civil liberties, or Nigel Farage's freedom of expression, or yours. But who are they, the people who stop us from even speaking? Now, it would be too easy a mistake to say that they're the hard left, because they're not, or they're not just the hard left. They're entirely respectable, utterly conventional, quite mainstream, progressive politicians, with all their obvious, unabashed followers in the bureaucracy. In a word, they're liberals. And what they're doing is liberalism. And it's the thing we National Conservatives have to fight. Now, before I get to how and why, I've got to say a few words about the general election last week in my country. Let me keep it simple. We were slaughtered, shellacked, given a good hiding, kicked while we were on the ground. It wasn't pretty. And who are we? We're the Tories. We're the oldest and until last Thursday, the most successful political party in British history. We're older than most countries, most constitutions, most ideas, good and bad, and we still got socked in the face. We lost half of our votes from the previous election and about 2/3 of our MPs, members of parliament. Brutal does not even begin to describe the bloodbath. So as of this week, everyone is learning their hard lessons, right? And learning is good, yeah? Of course not. Of course not. We had won a truly great majority in 2019, a landslide. We were promising to do what the British people wanted. We were going to use our newfound Brexit freedoms. I was a Brexiteer in our historic referendum of 2016. And we were going to use these freedoms to stop the waves of illegal migrants landing on our shores. We were going to cut taxes, and we were going to stop the lunatic woke virus from infecting our British state. In fact, we did none of this. Then tried sometimes to pretend when campaigning that we had done it. Because what the government mostly did after 2022, when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, was to roll out a programme that our new Labour government today could quite happily do, and probably will. There were farcical gimmicks, like the proposed smoking ban applied to people depending on which year you were born. There was more nonsense, like letting criminals out early and scrapping shorter sentences for low-level crime, undermining confidence in our criminal justice system, letting down victims and demoralising the police, something I fought back against from the backbenchers. Were there to be new homes to solve the housing affordability crisis in the UK, empowering younger generation to start a family and build up our society? No. We talked big, we published lots of policy documents, and we did precisely nothing. What we particularly didn't do was mention immigration. Don't mention the war, Basil Fawlty used to say. That's what we did on immigration. We didn't want to talk about it. Particularly, we didn't want to talk about the role of out-of-control population growth in one very small place has played on pushing asset inflation sky high, thus putting home ownership beyond the dreams of everyone, bar those with substantial personal family wealth. Now, as Home Secretary, I cut a deal with the Prime Minister back then. I backed him for the job as long as he pledged to back me to deal with the boats. Now, the boats is our way in the UK of describing our equivalent to your southern border crisis. The rush of illegal migrants crossing the English Channel into the UK illegally. These people, generally expensively shipped in by cruel and evil criminal gangs, are, in liberal theory, fleeing cruel and unusual France. Now, normally in progressive British political discourse, France is everything that we are not in the UK. They're sophisticated, they're modern, they're sensible and humane, supposedly. But for some bizarre reason, now over 100,000 people have fled this modern paradise and come instead to miserable, racist Brexit Britain. They do this in flimsy rubber dinghies, which cross 20 miles of the most dangerous and crowded shipping waters in the world. Tragically, many of them have drowned in the process trying to chase a dream of a life in the UK. I wanted to stop it, and I fought with the Prime Minister for a year to try and make it happen. But rather than do it, rather than live up to the pledge that he made in Downing Street, he refused to do what was necessary, and then he sacked me. He pledged, boy did he pledge, that the scheme that I put forward, a deterrent proposal to offshore the illegal migrants to a safe country in Rwanda, without letting them put a foot in the UK effectively, would go ahead without me. He promised, before he called the recent disastrous elections, that of course the flights to Rwanda would take off. Friends, I don't expect you to know the ins and outs of British politics, but tell me this, do you think those flights ever took off? Of course they didn't. Yet Rishi Sunak then called an election as if they had, or as if they were about to this time, if only the Tory party would get re-elected. Oddly enough, he wasn't believed. Now, I tell you this story because it illustrates so much. Because the key thing to understand for us in the UK, and I suspect for your and many countries as well, is wine. Too many Conservatives comfort themselves with the claim that things like this happen because of the blob. That's a mysterious, implacable entity in the administrative state which is stopping politicians from doing the things they claim to do when they're trying to get your vote. This is garbage, by the way. And the Tory failure to implement the Rwanda scheme and stop the boats shows you why. The reason it didn't happen was because Rishi Sunak didn't want it to happen. It was a choice by the politicians not to do it. It wasn't because it was impossible. And it certainly wasn't because he bravely tried yet nobly failed to get it done. It was because, although he publicly claimed time after time that he wanted to do it, he simply didn't. He set his face against doing it and accomplished that goal. The moral here is that we Conservatives have got to stop searching for phantoms to explain our own failures. And we've got to start looking at the politicians carefully. Those politicians who never meant their big talk in the first place. So having lost this election so disastrously, the Tories must now, realistically, be facing up to the future, aware of the mistakes that we've made and learning the appropriate lessons for the future, however personally or politically painful. So let me tell you another story. It's a story about how I knew Donald Trump was going to become president for the first time. I watched a primary debate, and there he was, the only man on stage saying what everyone knew and what everyone believed to be true, that our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had been futile failures. All the other candidates disagreed with him. All the talking heads and the grown-ups said, and how familiar this refrain was to become, he's really done it this time. Well, he had, but the only thing he had done was to tell the truth, that the wars were hubris, which weakened, not strengthened, the West. This was also something that just about every ordinary Conservative voter could see too. Now, regardless of what the commentators in the studio or on the Hill should be telling people to believe themselves. Exactly the same thing is happening in the UK at the moment as I speak. Why did we suffer the worst election result in our 300-year history? Because of what we had done, what we had left undone in the last 14 years. Because of our record, which the clear-eyed British public had seen all too clearly. Of course not. Of course not. That would be stupid. How naive of you to think that that would be the reason. Because if you listen to the professional right-wing pundits in Britain right now, the Conservative Party was decimated because, and in no particular order, division, disagreeableness, not singing from the same hymn sheet, and that most cardinal of sins, disloyalty. Because people like me had said, hey, look, careful, there's a cliff over there. That's really bad for buses. Do not drive the bus over that cliff. But it wasn't the bad driving of the bus that was the problem. No, of course not. It was being vulgar enough, rude enough, audacious enough to point out the warning signs, apparently. That's why we lost, according to some. So here's the thing, we weren't divided. We were united. The vast majority of the Conservative Party loyally backed Rishi Sunak and his disastrous policies. Whatever he wanted, he got. He pushed all of his policies through the House of Commons without obstruction. Contrast that with the Theresa May Parliament, where I, with many others, were successful in stopping her from moving forward on some serious disasters. But our problem now was that actually, in fact, there was far too little audible division. So if you listen to some of these pundits, the guys who cheered Rishi Sunak's strategy on, who proclaimed him and his gang to be the only grown-ups in the room, we lost because our campaign, and even more ridiculously, Rishi Sunak's government, was too right-wing. So you see, that's a mistake that we need to learn. Now that we are in shattered opposition, we mustn't be so unpleasantly right-wing. How right-wing were we? So where do I start? Well, shall I start with the BLM homilies that senior British civil servants would give to their legions of juniors? This is normality in the British civil service, overseen by us. Our civil service is famously politically neutral. So if you're a junior civil servant, you get an email from the person who controls the promotion track for your entire career, where this person lectures you on something that you don't really know much about, something that happened many thousands of miles away, and pontificates about things like white privilege, and advises you that if you want to move forward with your career, you've got to join in with the regular virtue signaling to show solidarity with those oppressed peoples around the world. What happens? Nothing. We Tory ministers, nominally in charge of the system, nominally in charge of the civil service, we completely fail to stop that nonsense. The progress flag would fly over our buildings as if they were occupied territory. I actually asked as a minister, why is this happening? And who says that it has to happen? I could never get an answer, or none that would be committed to paper anyway. I wanted to scrap the unconscious bias training, which taught the civil servants how bad and racist Britain was, and how evil white people are. And I was told that I would be on the wrong side of history to push forward that particular radical idea. Now, I don't say this to boast or to curry favour with you as an audience, but to starkly confess my failure. I couldn't even get the flag of a horrible political campaign that I disagreed with taken down from the roof of the government department I was supposed to be in charge of. Now, again, some of you, I suspect, will be tempted to knowingly say that was the blob, but it wasn't. It was other Tory politicians. My question, why is this happening, would go to 10 Downing Street, to the Prime Minister's office. And that's where the answer failed to come from, because, to repeat the point once more, far too many Tory politicians agreed, and still agree, that the progress flag must be flown. To be kind, to be inclusive. It shows how liberal and progressive we are. And that's what many Conservatives want us to be. Well, the progress flag says to me, it says to me one monstrous thing, that I was a member of a government that presided over the mutilation of our children in our hospitals and from our schools. right through our smoking ruin of a general election campaign, we claimed proudly that we were doing something about trans fanatics, when in fact, what we did was let it happen. I'm too physically repulsed to go into what it is, but it is something that the true grown-ups in any civilized society should never have allowed to happen to anyone else's. And this is our best defense, that we let it happen, that the fanatics who had worked their way through the institutions were negligently let to get away with it, perhaps by innocent ministers who couldn't comprehend their sick ambitions. But again, I have to tell you, this is simply not true. I, in the last Parliament, had colleague after colleague who didn't turn a blind eye to this, who weren't simply somehow tricked by monsters seeking to mutilate children. I had colleagues who supported it in the Conservative Party, who were fully signed up to this project, and who saw people like me, who opposed it, who wanted to stand up for the safety and security of our children, as not being just the villains, but somehow the people who were losing our party votes with our hateful words. So I can only apologise right now for what has thus far been a pretty negative and depressing speech. I am aware of that. But that's the thing. Things are really, really terrible for my party. And I cannot exaggerate how bad they are. We lost half our vote. We lost 2/3 of our MPs. 2/3. 2/3. This was justified punishment by the public because we didn't deliver on our promises. And it gets worse yet. The Tory party dominated the 20th century in Britain for any number of reasons. But one we shouldn't kid ourselves about was the fact that the left was divided. For most of the last 100 years, left-wing voters in Britain have been taxed with a choice of parties to vote for, whereas the Tories have monopolised the affections of Conservative voters. All that has changed with the arrival of Nigel Farage and Reform. We now face a credible threat, a credible rival for our right-wing voters. This, with our electoral system, will shred our votes massively, reducing the number of Conservative and Reform MPs who are elected. It means that Labour are not even 34% of the vote, won almost 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons. This is not just a defeat for my party, therefore. It's a moment of existential crisis from which we may not recover. But people have finally woken up, right? They've realised it's not just dark, it's the asteroid's shadow, and that we've got to act. Sweet, sweet child. Here's another story for you. The reason Rishi Sunak gave for finally sacking me was that I had said that the police were at risk of treating political marchers differently, depending on who was marching. Now, I had said last year that the Islamicist hate marches, full of anti-Semitism, racism, and thuggery, that were defacing central London and have become pretty much a weekly occurrence in our country, were in fact Islamicist hate marches. But that was an inappropriate thing to say. So fast forward to the election, Labour, in a year of unique triumph, still managed to actually lose 4 seats. And they lost them to sectarian Islamic campaigns, where Gaza was a bigger issue than anything happening in the UK. Some female Labour MPs, some noted feminists among them, were jostled at their counts where the result of the election in their individual constituencies was declared. Well, who were they jostled by? Who roared abuse at them? Who intimidated their staff and their teams? Well, if you listen to some of these infamously gobby feminists, they were jostled by idiots, or possibly men. Men. I've no disagreement with that. Listen, go and watch the videos. You'll see that there were definitely idiots who jostled them, and they were, in large part, men. But they were also patently, undeniably, angry, self-confident, Islamicists. These are the things Labour MPs can't even say out loud after they've happened to them personally. Consider this. The Conservative candidate whom Nigel Farage defeated to become an MP also had some choice words for his rallies. Now, Nigel Farage's rallies were entirely peaceful, and the only person who was attacked at any of them was Nigel, who was milkshaked. Do you do milkshaking here in the States? You love a good milkshake. But here's what my former colleague had to say. He compared these rallies to being reminiscent of the big rallies at Nuremberg. So it goes without saying, no, they weren't. But what do you say? What do you say when Conservative politicians are reaching for words to criticise a mere rival and compare him to genocidal murderers? And no one, of course, bats an eyelid at this. Comparing reform to the Nazis, hateful language, hysterical, nonsensical, offensive, obviously not. If anything, restrained and reasonable. Now, I used to chair the European Research Group in Parliament. We were, to use the parlance of the time, the hard Brexiteers inside the Tory party. The battles of Brexit were really tough between 2016 and 2019, and some people became excitable. One Labour MP in particular just hated us. Not that he has a reputation for being hateful. In fact, he's acclaimed as a nice guy by the people who determine these things. He's just become Keir Starmer's Foreign Secretary, in fact. But back then, when he was just a backbench Labour MP who hated Brexiteers, what did he have to say about me and the ERG? He too compared us to Nazis. So appalling a slur was this on us, not least on our Jewish members, that he got a bit of pushback for once. And his response? To say that his words hadn't been strong enough. Now, this guy's our new Foreign Secretary. And this sensitive, cerebral, diplomatic soul had views on President Trump, too. According to David Lammy, Trump is a neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath. So they're going to get off to a good start, I imagine. That we don't teach history well enough in British schools. We certainly need to start teaching more about basic comparisons. I long for the day when I'm denounced as having something of the whiff of Napoleon III about her. But that's just the left being the left. That is just the left being the left. It's a fact of life. Our problem is us. Our problem is that the liberal Conservatives who trash the Tory party think it was everyone else's fault but their own. My party governed as Liberals and we were defeated as Liberals, but seemingly, as ever, it's Conservatives who are to blame. Not least, for some of my colleagues, it's Reform voters who are to blame. How dare they not vote Tory? Don't they know we've a God-given right to their support? Doesn't matter what we actually do with it. This screaming entitlement goes hand in hand with toxic condescension. I have MP colleagues who believe it's racist to have voted for reform. That far from my shattered party wanting to get back these voters we've spurned, we should be glad that we no longer have their tainting support. I'll say something profoundly British now. The Tory party is never going to recover unless it learns some basic manners. We're entitled to not one vote, save the ones we earn by keeping our promises. How about that for an election strategy? Listen, Reform are not going to magically disappear unless we do something about the concerns of their voters. And I have to stress that. They are their voters now because we have driven them to Reform. Reform, a brand new party. It has no record to stand on. But their support is overwhelmingly due to how repulsive our record has been. Lots of my colleagues are solemnly muttering about how much they respect the result. But having mouthed these words, what does their solution turn out to be? Liberal conservatism hasn't been tried enough. We need to head even further and faster to the centre. If the Tory party has a future, it's by being conservative. My strategy is simple. I don't want to put Nigel Farage, leader of a rival party, in a comfortable place. I want to put him in an uncomfortable place. I want the Tories to credibly offer conservative policies which make the existence of a rival right-wing party moot. And not just moot, but which makes their continued existence seem visibly harmful to conservative goals being achieved. But the only way that we're doing that is by talking credibly to Reform's voters. And we haven't even started to respect them, never mind seriously address why they no longer vote for us. We satisfy ourselves by insulting them, denigrating the party, trying to throw mud. It makes us feel better. But the reality is we're pushing more and more of our own people away. It's why, if we are serious about continuing to exist, let alone win elections, we need credibility. Not just the veneer of right-wingery to win the base, only for the liberal reality to emerge under the pressure of scrutiny and challenge. That's what we've just tried. A cosplay right-wingery, only for the reality to be socialism light. The voters see through it because they're not idiots. Now, you can take from the example of Britain whatever lessons you think are applicable to your own countries. I take from everything that I have heard and read about the US and so many other Western countries this painful truth. We are at a moment of crisis. The chickens have come home to roost, and all the things that we Conservatives have warned about for half a century and failed to stop are now upon us. The palpable sense of discontent, a crisis of meaning, the dissolution of the ties and bonds of loyalty and society which formerly bound us into a cohesive, organic unit, the loss of faith in politics, the descent of formerly stable polities into states we once upon a time would have sneered at as being banana republics. Even in our countries, things worse than stopping you speak in Brussels happen. Political dissidents are persecuted by lawfare, with all the loss of faith that brings in its wake for democratic politics and elections. Now, the efforts made to delegitimize us seemingly have, in the US of all places, gone beyond the merely rhetorical that we're used to seeing in the UK. It should not be a custodial matter to contemplate public service. Yet, I know American politicians who've had to tell their children, if I'm arrested, it won't be because I've done something wrong. What has brought us to this place? The answer is liberalism. It's a creed now so self-righteous and so intolerant that anyone evil enough to disagree with it risks actual imprisonment. Yet liberals haven't been winning elections. The people have voted for conservatives. But the problem is, they are the ones who've delivered liberalism. These ideas are not the irresistible truths that liberal ideologues insinuate them to be. They're highly contested ideas that we're free to dispute. And dispute them we should. They're fundamentally wrong, arising as they do from the false assumption that custom and tradition, for example the common law, may be dispensed with in favour of solipsistic first principles rationalism articulated by educated individuals at any given moment in time. In practice, liberal conformity and uniformity leads to the cult of the self. Wealth is valued for its own sake. And where has that got us as a society? Cultural disorientation and the loss of home and belonging, that's where. The solution is conservatism, the conservatism of Roger Scruton, emphasizing community, family, place, attachment, love. I'm so proud to speak to you because National Conservatives know that the preservation of a national culture is precious, precisely because it unites. The most fundamental insight you offer, so well articulated by so many of the speakers I've heard at successive events, is that liberalism, both economic and social, has led us to a point of societal disintegration. My own Conservative Party, far from contesting liberal ideas, has embraced them wholeheartedly and offered no opposition. Where Thatcherism was national renewal, it was a reaction devoutly to be wished for. When it was degraded into being simple liberal economics, where the objective of personal material wealth was elevated above all else by Conservatives, it forgets what prosperity is really for. The slavish elevation of wealth as the purpose of life is fruitless and has allowed Conservatives to be caricatured as venal, selfish, and infamously nasty. We need to rediscover the why in politics, and that's not answered just with money. The Conservative surrender to social liberalism, the cult of self, of self-esteem, of self-realization, of self-absorption, is causing our societies to fracture. We must be unashamedly the champions of family, the party of duty, of love of country, service to our people, respect for all, community, traditional culture specific to our nation, the party of home. We must fight to protect our national culture, which is precious because it unifies us and it allows us to be at home in our own country. That culture is contained in our customs, in our religion, in our traditions, in our common law, in our architecture, in our music, our arts, our educational institutions, our sporting traditions, and our constitution. These things, sadly, have not mattered to far too many of us who call ourselves Conservatives. And as we emerge from this catastrophe in the United Kingdom, every Conservative policy must be evaluated by how well it serves those fundamental objectives. So philosophically then, and politically, the choice is clear. Do we keep doing what got us into this mess, or do we change? Do we start listening and start responding? Are we going to be brave and tell the truth, or will we be timid and continue the charade? You should be listened to. Your message is right. And it has been a pleasure, as ever, to be here and learn so much from you again. Onwards. Thank you.